All right, good morning. Today we are announcing a package of decisions that will continue to protect the health and lives of Washingtonians, including a 3-week extension of the current restrictions, as well as an economic aid additional package to help the people who are having difficult times as a result of these restrictions. This is because we remain concerned about COVID activity, and we still do not have a clear picture of the situation following the Thanksgiving weekend. So it is a 3-week extension. It is possible that we would be able to recalibrate before then if we have significant improvement, but we don't know enough yet about the pandemic's course and trajectory to be able to do that. So this remains an extremely alarming situation. Now, because COVID strikes both at our health and our economic well-being, we're also announcing an additional $50 million in additional grants for businesses, specifically those who have been hit hardest by these restrictions, as well as economic safeguards for workers who might be losing their employment and income as a result of the pandemic. This package is on top of the $135 million in economic relief that I announced 2 weeks ago. We're doing this in response to the overwhelming need for economic assistance during this crisis. We know this will not eliminate all of the economic suffering that people are experiencing. And we are continuing to push Congress as hard as we can for the ultimate source of relief from Congress. We will also continue working with legislators early in the next session to consider additional potential help as well. I appreciate the work of the Department of Commerce and so many local community groups and partners who've helped us help businesses in every way that we can through this really tough time. Just as a way of just sort of a background of some of the work we've done already, we have distributed billions of dollars, literally, in federal and state funds that have helped a panoply of industries and workers already affected by this pandemic. We have allocated $120 million in rental assistance, which aids families in need and landlords who are experiencing payment reductions. We've provided $69 million in food assistance. We've provided $15 million for energy bills for low-income households, $164 million for child care services, and $510 million to local governments and communities that have produced their own business innovations that have provided wraparound services to individuals, and business grants that have supported Main Street across the state. These rounds of business grants have helped keep a number of entrepreneurs afloat and workers on the job. We prioritize industries that have been hit hardest, restaurants, fitness centers, and bowling alleys, or that have experienced significant cumulative impacts like music and event venues. This additional $50 million will be directed to those that are affected by our recent directives. I've met personally with some of the business owners who've been able to benefit through these troubled times. I know how hard it has been for so many, especially as we head into the holiday season. And I realize that this amount is not going to solve everyone's problems associated with this pandemic. But I am grateful we've been able to do $50 million today so we can get that out the door as fast as humanly possible, as we continue to look for additional options for these hard-hit businesses. We have Department of Commerce has been very active in this, and I'd like to turn over to Lisa Brown, our Department of Commerce Director. Lisa.
Thank you, Governor. Very much appreciate the announcement today of an additional $50 million. As you've noted, this is an incredibly challenging time for businesses and employees. $50 million will allow us to double the number of businesses who will receive grants. For this current round of Working Washington grants, we have already received 16,000 applications, and there are thousands more that have begun the application process. because we want to get these funds out as soon as possible, we are emphasizing that we would like businesses to complete their application by December 11th so that we can go through the process to get the grants awarded by the end of the year and get those checks out by December 31st. I wanted to also note a shout out to those who are helping us in this process. Washington State University's Small Business Development Center has put 24 people on board answering email and phone call to provide technical assistance. So if businesses are having problems with the application, which we have tried to design as in a simple way as possible, please reach out for that assistance. The National Development Council, who helped us build the portal, is also fielding questions, providing technical assistance, and helping process the applications. And furthermore, we have a network of nonprofits around the state, our business resiliency organizations like Sister Sky in Spokane that supports Native American businesses, the Latino Community Fund in Central Washington that are also providing assistance to businesses in their communities to assist them in getting their applications in. As the governor mentioned, the priority for this round of funding, and this round of funding will have $100 million total, will go to those businesses that are being affected by these current restrictions. So we know that restaurants, breweries, bars, yoga studios, those types of facilities, music venues are most hard hit, and we will prioritize small businesses in every corner of the state, particularly in those most hard hit areas. And then finally, I just want to add, as the governor mentioned, that this is not just a Washington state challenge, it is a national challenge. And we are very hopeful that there is action by Congress that will allow us to take further steps for our employees and our small business owners. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Lisa, for your hard work. I know you're trying to do this as fast as humanly possible. We know how difficult this is for businesses, and I appreciate you trying to get this money out the door as fast as humanly possible. We know how tough this time is, but we know we are going to recover, and we ought to have confidence of that. You know, we've consistently been in the top 5 states in job growth before the pandemic hit, and there is no reason we cannot return to that exalted status as soon as this vaccine is widely available. So we know these are times dark, figuratively and literally, but there is really, really bright light, and that's this vaccine. And we believe that our economy can rebound quickly when this becomes widely available. And we want to help as many people across those troubled times as possible. But we do know this, while this COVID is at crisis levels, what we do now literally will be a matter of life and death for many of our citizens. And so our continued effort through these last months perhaps is the moment of utmost importance, utmost effort, and utmost return, both in life saves, but in our ability to restore our economy to its full productive level. So these are perhaps the most important days in the holiday season. And we know all faiths celebrate, or many faiths, in the dark months because they celebrate the light. And we've got some bright light right now, which is this vaccine that we're very, very excited about. However, at the moment, we have to face the reality. And the reality is that we are suffering a very dire situation with the pandemic. The case counts continue to increase. If I can show, this is essentially a 7-day rolling average. The dark line is the 7-day rolling average beginning in March 2020, and we're now over in November. We have seen very steep inclines during the month of November and into December. We see a possibility of some good news that in the last week or so, there may have been some lessening of the rate of increase. But we have troubling signs as well. A couple days ago, you see this gray spike These are numbers in the gray that will go up because in the gray, this is the part where the total count has not come in yet. But we had 7,000 just in one day. That's the big spike you see. This morning it was about 3,500, which is well above any of the blue bars. So we have troubling information as well. And the challenge for us is that we have not been able to get far enough post-Thanksgiving to find out whether or not we are having some degree of success restraining this beast. It's too early really to tell. And as I've said, there are some troubling signs like these big spikes we have seen in the last few days. So unfortunately, hospitalizations also are increasing. We're showing the numbers here of hospitals. We're now at 1,094 of confirmed COVID-19 patients in our latest date. That is extremely troubling because it's about 80% of our ICU beds are occupied. And so nearly 1,000 Washingtonians are in intensive care across our state right now. Medical workers are becoming overwhelmed, and families of the patients are now meeting our hardworking folks in hospitals who are exhausted from the former months. So we have a very difficult position because right now we have to understand that even if you're not a COVID patient, this crush in the hospitals can affect your treatment. I'd like to show you some of our projections about our hospital capacity. What we're doing is trying to project what kind of capacity we will have if the COVID pandemic continues. I'm going to show you two projections under different potential scenarios. The first projection, this solid black line shows bed occupancy for our hospitals. And the gray line as it goes up basically is a projection essentially if the numbers that we had last week were the rate of change would increase or would remain the same. We call that you've got the moderate case up here. Could you show the worst case right now? Okay, we're going to start with the worst case, so we're going to work on the optimistic level. So this is the projection for the hospitals if the pandemic at the rate of increase had continued as it was essentially set about a week or 10 days ago. And we'll show this, that by the end of December, we are at well over the capacity of our existing bed space by the end of this month. That's not that far away. Now, there's some additional surge capacity by these hospitals, but when that happens, there's extreme stress on the system. So if we are unable to arrest or slow down the rate of increase, what our modelers are showing us is that we will be in very troubled position by the end of this month, demanding surge capacity in our hospitals. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is a little bit more optimistic. We call this the moderate case. This assumes that we will be able to slow down the rate of change. And this slide shows that we will get to that surge necessity after the end of December, maybe a couple weeks into January. So we have to understand that these things can happen very quickly. And what it means is, in the worst case scenario, we'd need to nearly double our ICU capacity before the end of this year, which is extremely difficult to achieve. The reason it is difficult to achieve, more difficult than it was in May and June, is that we used to be able to draw on reserves. If your hospital in Spokane was becoming absolutely filled, you could bring in nurses maybe from Tri-Cities or Yakima. But that reserve capacity does not exist now because the pandemic is everywhere, not only in our state, but in the United States as a whole. So our system has less reserve capacity than it used to have. I also want to make the point that as ICU beds fill up, every person with a significant medical need is in trouble, not just those with COVID, but anyone who needs an ICU for any reason. So what happens in one part of the state has ripple impacts across the state, and what happens to anyone has an impact on everyone who might need ICU capacity. So we've been saying since the beginning, we are in this together, and we are literally in this together in the need to preserve our hospitals as functioning systems. Now, this 3-week extension will take us through the holidays and into the new year. There are no changes that I'm announcing today to that measure. But we understand that as we come into the December holiday season, just like Thanksgiving, all of us are going to have an opportunity to save lives while continuing to be responsible and not have large gatherings in our homes and otherwise that pose such a risk. I'm heartened during the Thanksgiving holiday. It appears Washingtonians have again led the nation in reducing the infections that happen in our family and relative gathering scenarios. That's what the New York Times survey showed. It was the right thing to do in November. It will be the right thing to do in December. And our ability, hopefully, to get out from under these restrictions and not have our hospitals overwhelmed, again, depends on us being in the holiday spirit in December. And the holiday spirit is to give the most precious gift of Christmas, which is life itself. And we will all be in a position to be able to do that by making our plans accordingly to enjoy our families just a little bit differently so we can all be together in the next December. I want to talk about a critical part of our package to help Washingtonians. When we think of businesses, it's obviously not just the business owner. We're providing an additional $50 million today for essentially the business owners. But it's the employees, obviously, and many of whom are going to lose their work, at least temporarily, that are very much at risk. And those in the gig economy who don't have what you think of as traditional employers are also at risk. So a critical piece of our plan to defeat the virus is for individuals that have financial resources while they have to stay at home. And too many workers are facing that risk today and that economic security. Now, the state and federal government has done a lot. Between March and November, we've paid out $12.6 billion in unemployment compensation in state and federal funds. Now, what would help Washingtonians and all Americans the most right now would be action by Congress on economic relief, including pandemic unemployment assistance that covers more workers than the typical unemployment insurance. And the reason that's important is Congress has more tools at its disposal than states do to solve this problem. So we are watching congressional negotiations very closely, and we're in constant contact with our congressional partners. We're hoping that Congress can make a bipartisan agreement before the end of this year, but Washington is preparing if they do not. So whether it's through federal or state aid, if Congress fails to act by Christmas, we will step up in the state to help workers and their families who are not covered by pre-pandemic unemployment insurance benefits. So if Congress does not act, the state will provide relief to those who are on the pandemic unemployment system as of the week of November 21st, and that will happen by the end of December. We will not allow people to fall off that cliff in the state of Washington if Congress does not act. We hope to know that they will, hopefully, but if they do not act, we will be there at a minimum for at least the first month of folks who would otherwise fall off that cliff. So otherwise, the pandemic, and the reason for this, the necessity is the pandemic unemployment assistance runs out as of December 26th, otherwise. This vital program has helped those not normally eligible for regular unemployment insurance, including business owners, self-employed workers, and independent contractors. The loss of pandemic unemployment assistance would push nearly 100,000 households in Washington closer to poverty, making it harder to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. So we are acting And that machinery of government is in place to be able to provide that relief in December if Congress does not act. Now, also pending in the U.S. Senate right now is a bill that would provide $120 billion relief for the nation's independent restaurants and their workers. It passed the House in October. It should be passed in the Senate. But one way or another, we need to come to the aid of these families. With that, happy to stand for questions. We have OFM Director David Schumacher, Secretary of Health John Weisman, our Office of External Relations Nick Struley, and Lisa are all ready to stand for your questions.
All right, up first we'll go to Rachel LaCourte with AP. Go ahead, Rachel.
Governor, you just mentioned that if Congress fails to act by the end of the month, the state will step in. Can you give more clarity on what that looks like? Are you saying you would call a special session in order to provide that relief, or is that something that you would address through other means?
We have the ability to do this through December without the necessity of legislative action. So we have the funds that are available to through executive action to do that. We've got concurrence from the legislative leadership. I think pretty much that all believe this is a wise move. So I think there's a good consensus this is the right thing to do. And importantly, we have started the machinery of the Employment Security Department already to be able to get this done and get those transfers to these bank accounts in December.
Rachel, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, question for Secretary Weisman related to vaccines. When will we learn exactly how many doses are going to which facilities and what's going into making those decisions?
Great, thanks for that question. So what we do know at this point is that for December 15th, we should be getting about 62,400 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. And during the month of December, total 219,000 of that vaccine. Right now, we're enrolling providers, and we are assuring that we'll be able to have a vaccine across the state. The first group who will be vaccinated are the high-risk healthcare workers. And then also during the month of December, we'll also be vaccinating folks in long-term care settings. So those employers are working with their employees to identify who's at highest risk, and using guidelines that we have are identifying those folks. So we will be making final allocations later this week and next week into which places they will go. It's important to remember there are over about 300,000 healthcare workers who fall in this high-risk category is our estimate. And that includes not just doctors and nurses, but also other support staff who are providing care to these individuals. So it's going to take us, a number of weeks to be able, and into January, to be able to get through to all of those folks.
All right, up next we'll go to Essex Porter with Cairo 7. Go ahead, Essex.
Yes, Governor, you noted the necessity for that pandemic unemployment relief. Are you asking Democrats in Congress to go ahead and pass the stimulus bill even with the liability protections for corporations so that relief will come to Washingtonians?
I'm not giving them direction of the specific compromise, but I'm urging them to find a solution to this problem. And that is extremely important. And I'm confident in the leadership of the Democrats who care about these working people to find a solution to make that happen.
All right, did you want to ask a follow-up, Essex?
Yes, to the Governor and to Secretary Weisman. Will schools be able to finally open in January, at least for the youngest students?
So we think there is increasing reason to be optimistic that we can open on-site instruction, sometimes in a hybrid model, in a way that is safe. And that increasing confidence comes from a combination of the experience that we've had with some of our schools that have been having on-site instruction, also in other nations, and also some of our modeling that we've looked at from the Institute of Disease Modeling. So we think there's increasing reason to believe that we can do this safely. But if we do this, we have to do this in a way that has a very secure hygiene systems to make sure that everyone is protected, students and educators and parapros and bus drivers and cooks and everyone else, to make sure that the right protocols are followed to make it as safe as humanly possible. So we're having talks this week with varieties of the community to get advice about that, of superintendents and educators and the PSC folks and the PTA to get their advice about what that would look like. We also believe that if school districts, of course, this is a local decision, we are not mandating this, we're giving recommendations, that starting with the earlier grades is the highest priority, because obviously these are the children who have most difficulty for remote learning. And so many places have started with the early grades with considerable success. So we think we're heading in that direction, but we have some work to do to make sure we can do this safely. If you ask educators to go back in the classroom, we want to make it as safe as possible and make sure the districts actually do their job to keep it as safe as possible.
All right, up next, we'll go to Jim Camden with a spokesman review. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, I'm wondering that $50 million that you announced today, are those grants or loans, and do they come with restrictions for the businesses, like not being able to lay off employees or furlough employees?
Lisa, do you want to answer that?
Sure. These are grants, and they are unrestricted except for the business demonstrating that they're in the industries that are most affected by the current restrictions. We know that they have fixed costs and expenses, and so these grants will be available for them to be able to mitigate the cost that they're experiencing during the shutdown.
The logic behind this is these businesses have a lot of variable costs that they may not have to incur when they're not open, of wages and food purchase and the like. But obviously they have fixed costs of leaseholds and insurance and other matters that this is designed to help them with.
All right, Jim, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yes, a similar type of question. If the state does extend pandemic unemployment assistance, will it be at the same level that the federal government has, or will it be at some lesser amount?
Well, it'll be probably end up even a little bit more than most people are getting and a little bit less for a few. And the reason is there's a sliding scale under the federal system. We do not have the capability to establish a sliding scale, so it'll have to be a one-size-fits-all. I'm not going to announce the number today because I don't want people putting that into their budgets today, but it will be a pretty healthy amount relative to the majority of the recipients.
All right, up next, we'll go to Drew Mickelson with King 5. Go ahead, Drew.
Morning, Governor. We know you're extending these restrictions on businesses. Was there any thought of looking at private gatherings, travel bans as we head into these holidays? It seems to be on an honor system and a recommendation, but was there any thought to perhaps putting in restrictions on travel as we head into the holidays?
Well, we think about these things literally daily or hourly, but as far as binding restrictions, that didn't get close to the goal line. We have found, happily, that our recommendations on travel advisory appears to have an effect in the state of Washington, more so than other places. And this is very pleasing that people have heeded that. Somebody told me the other day that some air traffic was down, by over 50%, as I recall. So it appears that our suggestion has been heeded by a lot of folks, and we really appreciate that. And I think this is why Washington continues to lead the nation, be one of the leading nations to keep this pandemic from raging, at least at a certain level, because Washingtonians are really making good decisions. When I last looked last night, we were in the top 5 of having the least number of infections, and it's because Washingtonians by large numbers have been masking up. Business owners have been doing their darndest to comply everywhere that they can, and individuals are making individual decisions to reduce their travel, to reduce the number of gatherings in their homes, and that's why we're doing relatively well. So big shout out to Washingtonians.
I think Nick had something he wanted to add there.
Nick, you have something?
Yeah, Governor, you covered it really well, and I would just add that this is what we're talking about today is a 3-week extension of that proclamation we issued back in November, which includes a prohibition on those indoor social gatherings with people from outside your household. So our proclamation did address that concept as well, and this would be an extension of that.
All right, Drew, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Any efforts going to be made to ramp up enforcement efforts on perhaps those gatherings that we just heard about, but also the restaurants that are blatantly defying the rules that are out there, the one Spiffy's in Lewis County, for example?
Yeah, there will be, unfortunately, some enforcement action necessary. But here's some really, really good news and hard news. This is hard. The vast majority of businesses are complying with these restrictions, the vast majority. And this is really hard for business owners to do. So it's really hard for them to have to close a restaurant and then see somebody else breaking the law when they've had to shut their restaurant. That is just not fair to them. So for those business owners that are breaking the law, which they're doing by staying open, you should have to answer to your fellow business people that you are jeopardizing in a sense and being very unfair to. So I want to thank the business owners who are being compliant. It is a difficult thing to do, but giant numbers and giant percentages are doing it in these difficult times. The enforcement mechanisms will be significant. The one restaurant you mentioned will be facing fines of, I think it's $9,000 a day. So they'll be facing fines already of over $60,000. So we do need to have compliance, and we will act accordingly to move towards compliance. The issue about social gatherings, there's two things to know about it. One, it may be the single most important thing in Washington right now is basically what we do in our own homes. Whether we have people over for dinner unmasked and thereby infect our best friends even though we love them. Whether we get our uncle infected when they come over to watch a Seahawks game. These are the most dangerous places in the state of Washington, which is so contrary to how we feel. We think of dangerous places like, the top of Mount Rainier next to a crevasse. No, the most dangerous places is kind of around our couches right now. And so our ability to restrain this pandemic and reopen our restaurants depends largely on our ability to recognize that and do that which is really unnatural, which is to not have these gatherings in our homes, even with people we're very close to inside, and to take it outside. Have small, you shouldn't have it over 5 people, and it should be outside if you're going to be conversing with people now. And masks always work, including outside. So this is the most important thing in the state of Washington right now, I would say. But it's also the place, obviously, we're not going to send the National Guard to anybody's house about this. So we're depending on the moral authority and the wisdom of Washingtonians and the love they have for their families to not infect each other. And so far, we think that has had some degree of success. As I indicated, the New York Times said we're the #1 state in the United States for people who buy into this. And the more people who do, the better off we're going to be, and the more people are going to be alive next Christmas or any other season that we celebrate, from Eid to any other.
All right, up next, we'll go to Austin Jenkins with Northwest News Network. Go ahead, Austin. Austin, are you there? Just a second. After that, we will go to Joey Thompson with the Everett Herald. Go ahead, Joey.
Governor, the New York Times has reported that the Trump administration declined to secure more doses of the Pfizer vaccine. Is this going to affect how Washington was planning on getting those weekly shipments?
No, because we had not planned on getting that level of shipment, so it doesn't change our sort of suggested numbers we're going to have. Obviously, it would have been nice to have them, but it's not changing our thinking at the moment. John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's correct. We know essentially what we're getting through December, and we know that there's likely to be weekly shipments after that. We don't know the volumes of those. Obviously, this depends on how much is purchased, the manufacturing process. So there are many factors here. I think the bottom line of importance is that there was this appropriate response to develop these vaccines and manufacture them even while they were in clinical trials, and taking that risk that if the vaccine didn't prove, effective or safe, those vaccines wouldn't be able to be given. So I think it was a prudent approach, and now as we know what the data are and as these vaccines get approved, obviously working with the companies to make sure they can manufacture, in a safe environment and quality product as quickly as they can is the priority. So as the governor said, we've only been planning for that initial allocation and waiting for understanding of what numbers might come later. And again, we've got the Pfizer vaccine that we're anticipating here, be reviewed tomorrow by the advisory committee, on Thursday. And then a week later, the Moderna vaccine will also be reviewed. So, hope is here. Vaccine is on the way. It's going to take a bit of time. And until then, we need everybody continuing to practice these safe practices and keep everyone healthy.
John, do you want to talk about the Moderna numbers? I'm not sure we shared those.
Yeah, so at this point for December, assuming the Moderna vaccine is approved, which, we need to wait for that to happen, we would anticipate about 182,000 doses of the Moderna vaccine by the end of the year. And again, both of these vaccines require a two-dose administration. The Pfizer vaccine about 21 days after the first dose, and the Moderna vaccine 28 days afterwards.
And the thing about these vaccines, this is an amazing achievement. Most of these vaccines, 5 to 8 years. This is done in months. This is just a fantastic gift. And when I think about it, I just hate to think people will lose their lives before just in the upcoming months because we're not wearing masks and the like. We had December 7th the other day. Reminded we lost over 2,000 sailors in Pearl Harbor. We're losing more people than that every single day in the United States right now. We ask people to go fight foreign wars. We ought to ask people, and we do ask people, to be wearing a mask right now. We're not asking people to go fight a foreign war. We don't think it's too much to ask to wear a mask because it'll just get more people to that magic day when that vaccine is distributed broadly.
All right, Joey, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you. Governor, critics of your new restrictions are going to say that they haven't had the quick impact that they did in the spring, but can you or Secretary Weissman talk about perhaps some limitations in the data? Obviously, we're still seeing cases rise. And with the idea of restaurants, people maybe not always telling contact tracers the whole truth. Obviously, if you're sitting across from someone you don't know, you can still get COVID, even if it's indoors at a restaurant. Can you talk about limitations and what you would say to the critics who are saying we're not bearing the fruit just yet?
Well, it's a bit of a long answer, but an important one. First off, what we did last spring was dramatically more disruptive to our economy and individuals' lives than we're doing right now. We're trying to avoid much, much more devastating economic pain that we suffered in the spring difficult as these restrictions are, they're in a much more limited number of parts of our economy than we did last spring. So we're trying to avoid that devastating and numbers of unemployment and the devastation that causes, while simultaneously being able to restrain the growth of this enough so that our hospitals are not overwhelmed. That's the goal. There's some evidence that that is bearing some fruit. As we indicated, if you want to put that up there again, if we just look at the graphs here again, I'll show you what I mean by this. You want cases here or hospitalization? Let's look at cases to start with. Get cases up here. So if we look at cases, you'll see the last few blue bars and the purple line seems to have moderated. Not quite flat, but certainly not as steep right in the last, few days. So these restrictions may have had a beneficial impact to reduce that curve, the rate of that curve. But it also may be a false spring for us because we still may not have seen the results of Thanksgiving weekend where people were getting together. And so this may go back up fairly shortly again as well. And as you've seen, like I said, there were 7,000 cases the other day and 3,500 this morning. Now, so there's some evidence that this is having a beneficial impact, and there's a huge caveat that it may not. So that is a challenge for us all. There are also issues with our data right now. The system has to deduplicate. Dedupe is the new term of art, which basically means to make sure we're not counting one person twice. And there's been some software difficulties for that our vendor that we've hired is trying to fix some of their software limitations. And we hope that that's been done, will be accomplished late next week or early next week to make that a much more efficient system. So yes, there are some limitations in our data right now, and we wish it was perfect. John, you want to add to that?
I think you covered it well. I mean, our takeaway at this point is that as we look at all our data sources and the ones that are on our dashboard and others, our sense is that we have decreased the acceleration. And that's good news because at the time when the governor implemented these rollbacks, we were accelerating very quickly over just a matter of days. So now we need to exercise the patience of giving the data enough time to see if indeed we are approaching a plateau or not. And there's nothing about the data that's magical. We just know that it takes, 5-7 days up to 2 weeks to develop symptoms after you've been exposed. And so as the governor said, Thanksgiving has not yet been essentially 2 weeks in our past in terms of that holiday weekend. And so we are watching every single day the data as they are coming in to just see what impact any travel that people might have done or gatherings they might have had have any impact on this. So we're seeing some positive signs that give us some hope. We'll go over those in more detail, certainly at our briefing tomorrow, on Wednesday, tomorrow, at our usual Department of Health briefing.
If I may just discuss the difficulty of these decisions, we're going to know more on December 14th than we know today. But we thought it was fair to the restaurants and other companies to give them this advice right now because they're planning food to purchase and the like. So we're trying to balance giving people foreknowledge for planning purposes and recognizing that, we're just going to know more in the future.
Time for a few more questions.
All right, up next, we'll go to Austin Jenkins with Northwest News Network. Let's see if we've got you. Go ahead, Austin.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, a little bit.
Hello, no.
Maybe not. Maybe not, Austin.
A little bit. The question I have is just about the science behind continuing the restaurant restriction.
Austin?
Why not allow small tables?
Austin, we're having a pretty hard time hearing you.
Yeah, could you,
You have to email Josie.
Okay, never mind.
could you just email that question, Austin? Yeah.
All right, so then we'll go to Simone Del Rosario with Q13. Go ahead, Simone.
Hi, Governor. The president just announced or threatened to use the Defense Production Act if there's any problems with vaccine production, given this issue that they've had with the order with Pfizer. You've been very outspoken about using this in the past when it comes to PPE, so I just wanted to get your response to this announcement just minutes ago.
Well, a little bit of being flabbergasted that a man who refused to use this for months and months and months, much to our loss of life, would now bring this up is pretty astounding to me. We begged him to use this for months to get PPE for our nurses, to get swabs so we could increase testing, and he told us to go fish. And now he says he's going to come to the party and act. I just have to express more than amazement, but enormous disappointment in his total lack of responsibility. That's the first thing I just have to say. I don't know the circumstances of the relationship of the federal government and Pfizer on that prospective order. I don't know what Pfizer would say. We offered it to you, Mr. President, and you wouldn't take our offer. We offered it to you and you refused our offer, and now you're using the Defense Production Act. I don't know legally how that would work. So I can't give you sort of any analysis whether it's legal or not. I just heard about this from your question, so I'll have to reserve any particular judgment.
Simone, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yes, this is likely for Lisa. How big are these grants? How much money per business is being handed out? And what is that money based on?
So we announced originally grants up to $20,000. And what we want to do is see how many businesses apply and look at the total resources. And as I mentioned before, it's important that we have equity in these grants, and that is with respect to regional equity as well as with respect to small businesses that historically have received less resources or access to capital. And so we will be essentially figuring that out over this next brief period of time. And on December 11th, we'll know how many businesses have applied and how many are in those critical categories of restaurants and fitness facilities that are currently not operating. And that is our priority, as the governor said. So I can't tell you for sure. Obviously, smaller grants means more businesses can receive a grant, and larger grants mean that more will not be receiving a grant at this point in time. But I also want to just reiterate what the governor said is this is what we can do now with the CARES Act dollars we have left. That need to be spent by December 31st. If we get more information about congressional aid coming forward, either directly to businesses or through the state or through local governments, then that means that there will be more assistance out there. And we know that the governor and the legislature are considering other sources of funding should Congress not act.
Yeah, and the session starts January 12th. I know there's considerable interest to see if there's additional things that could be done. I don't want to say for sure that's going to happen, but I know there's considerable interest in the legislature in that regard.
All right, we've got time for just about 2 more questions. So up next, we'll go to Patrick Quinn with Como 4. Go ahead, Patrick.
This one is going to be a 3 weeks extension. What will you be looking for as you've just laid out? You're still really waiting on Thanksgiving numbers. There may be some limitations in the current data. What are you going to be looking for to maybe lift these restrictions in early January as promised, or what will extend them, especially with so many factors in the data unknown?
Well, I think the primary one is hospital capacity. What would be our hospital capacity as the weeks go by, and what do we project will be the hospital capacity? Now, to answer that question, the most important one obviously is the rate of growth in the pandemic, but also the ability of the hospitals to ramp up their capacity, watching that, what they're actually able to bring on in the real world. You know, we have projections on paper of what hospitals report, but sometimes there's a difference in the real world. So ultimately, the ultimate guide is what we can do to restore a functioning medical system where people are not losing their lives on gurneys in the hallways of hospitals. And that's the ultimate guide.
All right, Patrick, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, what proof do you have, especially since businesses have been closed, or restaurants out there, let's focus on restaurants and bars for the last 3 or 4 weeks. What proof can you show them that you've mentioned maybe some slight improvements in the data, but you know, what can you tell them that what they're doing is working, not having indoor dining?
I can tell them that to a scientific certainty, there are fewer people infecting each other, sitting across the table for an hour and a half without masks, breathing on each other, that there are infections going on in restaurants. This is a scientific certainty. And at the moment, there is at least some suggestion that this is having a positive impact. At this moment, it is more of a suggestion than proof. But it is beyond a reasonable doubt that infections take place in restaurants because it's the place where people speak to each other in close proximity for a prolonged period of time. And that's just a scientific reality. There is no dispute about that. There are other ways you can mitigate this in many other businesses. In a clothing store, you can mitigate that by standing farther apart and wearing a mask, and you have much lesser period of time. You can't do that in a restaurant in indoor dining. So there are just things that can't be mitigated in a restaurant. This is the only way to do it. And that's despite the best effort of restaurateurs who've been very innovative and very creative trying to reduce the risk, and my hat is off to them. But there's just no scientific doubt about this certain situation. And by the way, you know, it could be a benefit too that it hasn't gotten worse. That can be a win too. So I think we're on the right beam. We're going to look at this data very, very carefully. This extension could end up shorter if there was significant improvement. And unfortunately, people know it could end up longer if there's a deterioration. But at this moment, we wanted to strike the right balance of allowing business owners to plan the next several weeks and deal with this uncertainty of the data. And this is the best balance that we can strike, and we know how difficult this is. That's why we're putting in $50 million today, and as I've indicated, there's going to be consideration of more at a later date.
All right, for the last question, we will go to Hannah Scott with Cairo Radio. Go ahead, Hannah.
Hi, thank you. My first question is for Secretary Weissman. I'm wondering if you can offer some clarity. There's big confusion over the data, the numbers, especially over this last weekend and the 7,000 or so that came out yesterday because of the duplicates and the backlogs. Can you explain if you have a good sense, given that confusion over the data, the big drop in the contact tracing goals, do you feel like you have a good sense of what the COVID-19 is actually doing in the state right now?
Thanks for that question. Yes, we do. And again, we're looking at all of our data and seeing what it all tells us. The case counts that we have, we are, now current with our case counting. There was a slowdown in the processing system over the weekend that took longer to get through the cases. We do have the duplicate issue. We know that that's about 1,500 cases at the very moment, and we have folks working on that every single day to deduplicate those. The important thing is with those data is looking at the epidemiology curve that the governor showed. That really gives us the sense of where we are, and we have confidence in that overall picture. We also are looking at, as the governor said, many other data sources, including hospitalizations, and looking at the rise of those, looking at deaths. We also are looking at data real time, essentially in the last 24 hours of people going to the hospitals with ERs with COVID-like illness, and those are showing some decline as well. So, the beauty of this is that by looking at all these data sources and understanding, are they all telling us the same things? Are there conflicts? Those things all go into our thinking about where we are. And if you've got a problem with one data system at that moment in time, you've got all these other indicators that you continue to look at. That's the beauty of, I think our approach of looking at all of these. And, the public health systems across the country, our data systems have never been under this kind of strain before. We have folks who are working around the clock, monitoring these systems, problem solving, working with the best minds in Washington state, as contractors who are problem solving all of these issues every single day. And these are systems that are working 24/7 without a break. And anybody who monitors or works with systems like this knows that's a challenge whenever they need to be running constantly. So I'm proud of the work the team is doing and confident in the overall picture and the fact that we have multiple data sources that we're looking at to make sure that we've got the picture right.
If I can add something that we're really fortunate to have, could you put the hospitalization numbers up? One thing we do have that's probably the most concrete evidence of real activity is our hospitalization data. So the issue with the number of cases, those are always kind of arguable because it depends on how many people get tested. If twice as many people get tested, you're probably going to have additional cases. So there's always a little argument about what the case numbers of positive cases means. What there isn't an argument about is the hospitalizations of people who have COVID. And if you look at this, we're at 1,094 just in the last week or so. And there's just no doubt about that. So that is really high confidence type of data to make decisions from. The problem with the hospitalization date, the bad news is it's 2 weeks behind whatever was going on when people became infected. So you may have something really bad going on in your community that you don't pick up because they don't get to the hospital within that period of time. So this to me is the most concrete evidence is what's really going on in our community. And as you've seen, we've had explosive growth.
Hannah, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
For the governor, clarity on the unemployment situation. If the federal government doesn't do anything before the end of the month, would the state step in on all of the programs that are expiring for unemployment or just the one that allows those who don't normally qualify?
At the moment, just the pandemic unemployment assistance. That's about 100,000 families are affected by that. That's all we think we can do structurally under this. There are some inhibitions, but that's what we can do. So we're doing what we can do, and I'm pleased by that because we want to give people credibility or assurance. We don't want to have them to worry the next 3 months or 3 weeks because Congress is unable to come up with a plan. So we wanted to give people confidence that that will be there in December for them. Yes, I want to thank Washingtonians. We are again leading the way. Over 1 million people have signed up for the WA app, cell phone data to find out if you've been in proximity who's someone positive. I don't know for sure, but just looking around, it's one of the highest rates of uptake, I think, in the United States, because we're tech savvy and we want to protect ourselves and our loved ones. So congratulations to Washingtonians. I encourage people to take a look at that. We think that can be one tool that can really help us out. With that, I want to say that this has been one of the more difficult decisions in our state facing this pandemic. We've had many in the last several months, but this is one of the more difficult, at least in my view, because of the economic strains that people are under. And we're going to do what we can to help people, as we've indicated today, and we're not done in that regard. But it is also a time of great light. The fact that we're going to have a vaccine literally in days is extraordinarily good news for our state and our people. And I hope that it emboldens us to recommit ourselves and re-energize ourselves and get in touch with the strength of our innate resilience in the next several weeks to get to that vaccine. So this is a good day for us, and I look forward to better days ahead. Thank you very much.